strides through the deserted road. But it wasn't the cold that made John tremble. It was the voices, faint like whispers in the distance, always calling his name. They had started days before, the moment he stepped foot back in Fairview. At first he thought he was hearing things, echoes of a past he had buried, but now he knew they were real. Last night the whisper had become a scream, a single word repeated, "Come back." He woke up sweating, with the sound of a child's laughter echoing in his ears. Starlight Amusement Park, the abandoned amusement park, was there, waiting for him. Waiting for something much worse. The biting autumn wind swept through the deserted streets of Fairview, carrying with it the acrid smell of dry leaves. John Baker never thought he'd be back in the town he had tried so hard to forget. His boots hit the cracked pavement, the sound echoing through the corners like a distant lament as he walked toward the town's abandoned center. The sun, low on the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows over the decaying shops, their facades a reminder of the time when Fairview prospered. Now everything seemed dead, everything except the memories. John had been back less than a week, and the feeling of failure was already unbearable. The noise of the big cities, the lights, the people, everything he had longed to escape from now seemed as distant as the dreams he had abandoned. He had returned to the same starting point, to the town where everything felt frozen in time. The town where his father, a man broken by life, spent his last days in deep silence. As John walked through the familiar streets, he couldn't help but feel the oppression of the past pressing against his chest. The name he didn't want to remember came like a whisper in the wind. Starlight Amusement Park. The amusement park where his father had worked until the end, before it was abruptly closed after a series of strange and disturbing incidents. The park, now as deserted as his soul. He didn't want to go there, but part of John felt like he had no choice. Before he could sink completely into his thoughts, he heard quick footsteps approaching. Rachel Davis, his old childhood friend, appeared from the other side of the street, a look of surprise on her face when she saw him. "John?" she called, her voice full of disbelief. "I thought you'd never come back." John forced a smile, but the weight of his return was visible. "Well, here I am, back in the same place, and you, surviving," Rachel replied with a tired look. But there was something more in her expression, something John knew all too well. Unresolved fear. They exchanged few words, but the name neither of them wanted to mention lingered there, lurking in every pause of the conversation. And then Rachel said what he feared to hear. "Have you heard about the park?" John hesitated for a moment, Rachel's words echoing in his mind. The park. He knew exactly what she was talking about, but he wasn't ready to revisit that place, let alone the dark memories tied to it. I've heard," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady, but Rachel caught the nervousness in his tone. "I know it sounds crazy," she said, looking down, "but ever since I got back I feel like something is still there. Waiting. I can't stop thinking about what happened." What had happened at Starlight Amusement Park was a wound that never healed for Fairview. 3 children mysteriously disappeared on the last night the park was open, and all the staff were questioned. But no one had answers. No bodies were ever found. Among the missing was Rachel's best friend. The park closed soon after, left to rot on the outskirts of town. John sighed, knowing that somehow he also needed to go back there, maybe to face his own ghosts. Maybe to understand why his father always returned from that place with a lost look in his eyes, as if he had seen something he couldn't explain. "When do you want to go?" he asked, surprising himself with the sudden decision. Rachel raised her eyes, a flicker of fear and relief in them. "Today. Now." In less than an hour they stood before the park's rusted gates. The once vibrant and colorful sign was now faded and falling apart. The words Starlight Amusement Park were still legible, but covered in moss and grime, as if time had tried to erase the terrible history the place held. The park was in absolute silence except for the distant sound of the wind, which passed through the abandoned rides, making the old swings creak slightly. John could feel a chill run down his spine. It was as if the place was watching, waiting. "Shall we go in?" Rachel asked, her voice almost a whisper. John just nodded. They crossed the gate, which creaked like a warning. Inside, the park seemed even more sinister. The carousel, once bright and full of life, was now still, its wooden horses chipped and the metal poles rusted. The eyes of the horses, crudely painted, seemed to follow their steps. "My God," Rachel murmured, "it feels so wrong." They walked slowly, passing the Ferris wheel, which was now frozen in time, its cabins gently swaying in the wind. As they moved forward, John felt the discomfort growing, as if the very air around them was becoming heavier, denser. "John." A familiar voice startled them, and they turned abruptly. Tyler Mitchell, an old schoolmate, stood behind them, holding a backpack and a camera in his hands. He had an excited smile, but his eyes revealed a morbid curiosity. "I knew you guys would come here."
Everyone's been talking about how you two have been visiting the past. I figured I couldn't miss this chance.
"Tyler, what are you doing here?" Rachel asked, a touch of suspicion in her voice. "I've always been curious about this place. Something's wrong here, don't you think? I thought I could document everything. Maybe even find some evidence of what really happened to those kids." Rachel and John exchanged glances, both reluctant, but they knew Tyler wouldn't leave easily. With tension rising, they headed for the center of the park, where the old circus tent loomed. The red and gold fabric of the tent was faded and torn in many places, but the silence around them was what disturbed them the most. The wind had stopped. "And if that thing really is in there?" Rachel whispered, more to herself than to the others. No one answered. The circus tent, the last place the clown of silence was seen before the park closed. John had never believed in ghosts, but at that moment he felt something deep inside. A sense that crossing that threshold would mean more than just facing memories of the past. It would mean facing the terror itself. The circus tent loomed ahead of them like a monument to fear. Its faded colors and torn fabric fluttered gently in the breeze. John looked at the entrance of the tent with the feeling that he was about to cross an invisible line, a boundary between the real world and something much darker. Rachel stopped beside him, staring at the structure with a somber expression. She was trying to hide her fear, but John knew that look. She remembered the lost friend. That tent was the last place he had been seen before vanishing forever. "This is where it all began," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. Tyler, unlike the two of them, seemed excited. His eyes gleamed with the anticipation of the unknown as he adjusted his camera. "This is perfect," he muttered, looking through the lens. "If there's anything here, I'm going to capture it." John shot him a warning look, but knew it was useless. Tyler had always been the kind of person who thrived on danger and the thrill of the unexplained. "Let's get this over with," John said. More to convince himself than to rush the others, he took the first step, pulling back the heavy curtain at the tent's entrance. The air inside was colder, heavier, as if it had been sealed for years. The smell of mold and decaying fabric surrounded them immediately. But what really made John's stomach churn was the absolute silence. Outside, the wind still blew lightly, but inside the tent, it was as if the sound had been sucked away, left to die somewhere in the depths of the darkness. In the center of the tent were rows of old chairs, many of them overturned or broken. Clown mannequins were scattered among the chairs, lying grotesquely, their painted faces cracked and their fabric bodies torn. The gaze of each one seemed to follow the three intruders, silently watching. Where's the stage?" Rachel asked, her voice almost a whisper. She looked around as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Tyler began walking toward the center of the tent, his camera focused on the surroundings. He didn't seem to feel the same oppressive weight that enveloped John and Rachel. "I've heard stories about this tent," Tyler began, his voice a bit louder. "They say this is where the clown of silence used to perform. He never spoke a word, just watched. The kids loved him. But something happened on the last night, something no one can explain." John didn't want to hear any more. Every word Tyler spoke seemed to make the atmosphere around him heavier, more suffocating. The silence was so thick that even their own footsteps seemed muted, as if the sound was being sucked from the air. Rachel took a step forward and stopped abruptly. "John, did you hear that?" John stopped and looked at her. "Hear what?" "Someone whispered my name," she said, her voice trembling. John felt a chill run down his spine. He looked around, but all he saw was the same desolate scene. The clown mannequins with their vacant stares, the old chairs, and the decaying stage. "There's no one here, Rachel." "I swear I heard it," she insisted, wrapping her arms around herself, visibly shaken. Suddenly a sound broke the silence. Not a human sound, but a subtle creaking like metal moving. Tyler turned his camera toward the noise and saw at the far end of the tent one of the clown mannequins swaying gently from side to side. The ropes holding it were taut, but there wasn't enough wind to move it. "What the hell?" John began to say, but he was interrupted. Tyler tried to speak, but no words came out. He touched his throat, panic written on his face. His mouth moved, but no sound came. He began gesturing frantically, pointing to his throat, desperately trying to scream. The terror in his eyes was palpable. John and Rachel froze, watching as Tyler started backing away, shaking his head, his lips trembling in an eerie silence. The air around them seemed to close in, while the feeling that something was watching them grew stronger. "Tyler?" Rachel took a step toward him, but stopped when she felt the same sensation, a dark, invisible presence pressing against them. That was when John realized the clown of silence wasn't just watching. He was taking something from them. Tyler collapsed to his knees, clutching his throat, but not a single sound came from his mouth. His eyes filled with tears, panic growing with each passing second. It was as if the sound had been ripped from his existence. "We need to get out of here," John said with a trembling voice, grabbing Rachel by the arm. But when he tried to call Tyler again, his own voice began to fade, becoming a weak echo, almost inaudible. And for a brief moment, John thought he saw something in the corner of the tent. A pale figure, with a painted face and a grotesque, frozen smile. The clown of silence had awoken. Panic spread quickly among them like an invisible virus that drained all hope. Tyler was on the ground, his eyes wide, his hands shaking as he clutched his throat. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. His mouth moved desperately, but the silence was absolute, suffocating. John and Rachel couldn't process what was happening. They looked around the tent, their eyes fixed on the decrepit clown mannequins, as if expecting something worse to happen at any moment. And the worst was indeed only beginning. "Tyler." John tried to call him, but his own voice began to falter. His words came out like a distant echo, weak, as if the sound was being dragged away before reaching anyone's ears. This can't be happening." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What's happening to us, John? This isn't real." But even as she spoke, her voice began to fade, turning into a faint whisper, almost inaudible. The silence, once just an unsettling feeling, now became oppressive, a tangible presence around them. The tent, already dark, seemed to close in on itself, as if the space around them was contracting, sucking away all the air, all the sound, all the life. John looked around frantically, trying to find an exit, a way to escape this nightmare. He started walking toward the tent's exit, but something felt disturbingly out of place. The red curtains, which had swayed with the wind earlier, were now still, as if time inside the tent had stopped. Rachel began to follow John, but stopped abruptly. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something behind him. "John!" She tried to scream, but her voice was completely gone now. No sound came from her mouth. She raised a trembling finger and pointed. John turned slowly, fear growing in his chest, and then he saw it. The clown of silence stood there motionless in the darkness at the back of the tent. He was a pale figure, almost ghostly, with a frozen smile on his white-painted face. The vacant, penetrating stare of his glass eyes followed John's every move, as if watching every thought. He didn't move. He didn't laugh. He didn't speak. But the terror emanating from him was unbearable. John tried to scream, but nothing came out. The feeling of helplessness washed over him as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. He grabbed Rachel by the arm and forced her out of the tent with him, leaving Tyler behind. The terror had become so overwhelming that fleeing was the only option. Outside, the air felt different, heavier. The park, which had already been unsettling, now seemed alive. The rusted rides were still, but somehow John felt they were not alone. Rachel clutched John's arm tightly, her nails digging into his skin, but neither of them dared to speak. Their eyes were fixed on the carousel, which, inexplicably, began to turn slowly. The lights flickered, emitting a pale, intermittent glow, as if the park was waking up. They ran aimlessly, trying to find the exit to the park. The sound of their footsteps hitting the ground was the only noise they could still hear, but even that sound began to fade, swallowed by the oppressive silence that chased them. And then came the laughter. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A child's laughter. John stopped, panting, looking around. "Did you hear that?" He wanted to ask, but there was no sound in his voice. He looked at Rachel, who was also pale, her eyes wide with despair. They couldn't speak. They couldn't communicate. The silence had stolen their voices, their words, and now it seemed like the very sound was being stripped from their lives. The laughter returned, Closer this time, a laugh that echoed from the shadows, mixed with the soft sound of something dragging across the ground. John turned, trying to identify the source, but everything around him felt wrong. The entire park seemed distorted, as if it was shifting, reorganizing itself. The shadows were longer, deeper, and the silence was suffocating. Rachel pointed frantically at the Ferris wheel. A small figure was sitting in one of the cabins, gently swaying, a childlike silhouette. The laughter came again, clearer this time, but still muffled by the oppressive silence. John felt a tightness in his chest. It couldn't be. Rachel pulled him by the arm with surprising strength. She pointed toward the exit of the park, indicating that they needed to leave now. But something inside John hesitated. He looked back at the Ferris wheel, at the small figure that seemed so familiar. It was as if the park was calling him, as if it was begging him to stay. But he knew he couldn't. They ran toward the exit, their breaths quick and heavy. But the sound of their footsteps and breathing was fading, being sucked away by the air around them. John knew they were losing more than just their voices. They were losing themselves. The world around them seemed distorted. As if the park was changing with every second, John and Rachel ran toward the exit, their hearts pounding in their chests. But something was pulling them back. Every step felt harder than the last, as if the ground was sinking beneath their feet, trapping them in place. When they finally reached the park's entrance, panting, an invisible barrier seemed to stop them from crossing the rusted gates. It was as if the park refused to let them leave. Rachel looked at John, her eyes filled with fear, and shook her head desperately. They needed to find another way to escape. Then something caught Rachel's attention. A reflection on the ground, coming from an old, rusted box hidden behind a food stall. With trembling hands, she approached and opened the box. Inside was an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. John slowly approached as Rachel flipped through the pages. The journal seemed to belong to one of the park's former employees, maybe even someone who had known the Clown of Silence. "I don't know if I want to read this," Rachel whispered. Her fingers paused at the edge of the page, but at the same time she knew she had to. They needed to understand what was happening, no matter how terrifying the truth might be. The first few pages talked about the park's routine, the shows, the attractions, the children's laughter. But as the pages went on, the tone became increasingly disturbing. The park, once described as a joyful place, was now referred to as a trap. Something was wrong with the circus, with the children who entered, with the clown who never spoke. Rachel read aloud in a soft voice while John kept watch, expecting at any moment for the Clown of Silence to reappear. The children were drawn to the clown's presence. They laughed and ran, but something changed when he took the stage. The silence, always the silence, and then they just disappeared. They were never seen again. John felt a chill creep down his spine. "Disappeared?" he muttered, more to himself. Rachel continued reading, her voice growing more shaky. The journal spoke of rituals, of silent sacrifices. The clown, whose name no one knew, had been tormented since childhood, deprived of both voice and love. His revenge was stealing the children's voices, trapping them in an eternal cycle of silence. "They never left," Rachel whispered, looking at John with wide eyes. "The children, they're still here." Suddenly the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing around them like an invisible current of despair. Children's voices murmured, and the shadows around the park began to move. John felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. He looked at the Ferris wheel, now completely still, and saw the same small figures that had once appeared only as shadows. Children, ghostly children, standing in the cabins, their mouths open in a silent scream. It was as if they had been frozen in time, trapped in an eternal nightmare. "Rachel, we need to get out of here now," John tried to say, but his words were almost inaudible. The silence around them was closing in again. Rachel looked at him in despair, and that's when she saw him, the figure that had haunted her since childhood. "Danny." Her voice failed completely when she saw the boy. It was him, the childhood friend who had disappeared in the park so many years ago. He stood there in the shadows with the same sad, empty eyes she remembered. He hadn't aged, still a child, but now a pale shadow of what he once was. Rachel collapsed to her knees, the terror and guilt consuming her. "It's my fault. I should never have let you come here." John tried to pull her up, but she was paralyzed. Silent tears streamed down Rachel's face as the boy, or what remained of him, watched her. It was a mute lament, a cry for help that could never be answered. Meanwhile, the pages of the journal she held began to stir on their own. Moved by an invisible force, John looked down and saw the final words scribbled there, nearly erased by time. He's still here, he's always been here. And now he wants more. The circus tent behind them began to creak as if it were alive. The sound of ropes being pulled echoed, and John knew what was coming. The clown of silence, he thought, feeling the presence approaching. John finally managed to lift Rachel, and without another word they began running again. But as they ran, something became clear. They weren't just victims. They were connected to this place somehow, and the park wouldn't let them leave without a price. John pulled Rachel with all the strength he had, his lungs burning with every breath. The park, once a silent ruin, now felt like a living prison, a pulsing entity that surrounded them, draining their hopes and destroying their voices. In the distance, the lights of the Ferris wheel flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them like hands trying to grab them. They ran without looking back. The children's laughter still echoed faintly in the distance, but now there was something more, a presence. Something cold and relentless that followed them silently, waiting for the right moment to strike. The clown of silence was close, John knew it. He could feel it. Rachel, still in shock after seeing Danny, could barely walk. Her legs felt heavy as if the very ground was holding her feet. Fear engulfed her like a thick fog, clouding her mind. She kept glancing back as if expecting Danny to appear again, his empty, accusing eyes staring at her. John stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning for an exit. The park seemed to be shifting around them, as if the paths they once knew no longer existed. Every direction he looked seemed to lead them back to the center of the nightmare. And then he saw it. The clown of silence was there, standing in front of the old circus tent. His pale figure stood out against the dark sky, the faint lights flickering around him. He didn't move. He just watched them with that frozen smile without making a sound. His long skeletal hands hung at his sides, but something was mortally wrong with his posture. John tried to scream, but as before, no sound came from his mouth. The silence was complete now. Even the wind had disappeared. It was as if they were trapped in a bubble of darkness where time and sound no longer existed. Rachel tried to run, but her feet felt heavy, and she collapsed to her knees, silent tears streaming down her face. Her lips moved, but the only thing John saw was the absolute despair in her eyes. She was giving up. The clown took a step forward. John knew he had to do something. He had to fight, even if there was no way to win. He grabbed Rachel by the arm and tried to pull her, but she was frozen, paralyzed with terror, and then he realized it wasn't just fear. Something invisible was holding them, draining their energy, their willpower. The park was alive somehow, and it was determined to keep them there. The clown of silence slowly approached. Each step was a blow to John's chest, as if every movement the clown made drained a little more of his strength. He looked around, desperate, searching for a weapon, anything he could use to defend them. But the park was empty, desolate, a reflection of his own despair. He turned to Rachel, his eyes locked on hers, silently begging her to react, but she was staring at something far away, something John couldn't see. And then she whispered with no sound, only the movement of her lips, "Danny." John turned again, his heart pounding. The boy was there, just a few feet away, standing between them and the clown. His small figure was a shadow, a pale blur in the darkness. He watched them with the same empty eyes, but now there was something else, a silent plea. The clown stopped beside Danny, his skeletal hand resting on the boy's shoulder. The smile on his face was wider now, a grotesque distortion of joy. John understood what was happening. He realized at that moment that the park, the clown, the children, it was all connected. The clown fed on the children's souls, trapping them in eternal silence, and now he wanted more. Rachel suddenly stood up, her eyes fixed on Danny. Her feet began to move slowly toward the boy and the clown. John tried to grab her, but she slipped from his reach as if pulled by an invisible force. "No!" he wanted to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. Rachel walked toward the clown, her eyes vacant as if in a trance. John ran after her, but the silence around him was so dense, so oppressive, that it seemed to slow his every movement. Every step felt like wading through thick, suffocating mud. The clown raised his hand slowly, his skeletal fingers reaching for Rachel's face. John knew that if he touched her, it would be the end. She would be consumed by the same fate as Danny and the other children, condemned to eternal silence, without a voice, without a life. And then, in a burst of desperation, John did the only thing he could. He screamed. There was no sound but the effort of screaming, of using all his strength, of fighting against the oppressive silence that surrounded him, broke something. He felt a wave of energy surge through his body. It wasn't sound that came from his mouth, but an invisible force, a surge of life. The clown of silence stopped. His glassy eyes slowly turned toward John, the frozen smile faltering for a moment. John kept screaming, soundlessly but with all his soul. He knew they had to break the cycle, that somehow they had to fight the silence with everything they had. Rachel stopped walking. The trance was broken. The clown hesitated, and then, like a distant whisper, John heard the sound of his own voice, weak but real. "Rachel?" She turned, tears in her eyes. She heard him. John reached out his hand to her, and she took it. Together they started running, leaving the clown of silence and the ghostly children behind. The park somehow loosened its grip, allowing them to run toward the exit. The lights flickered frantically, and the sound of the wind returned. They crossed the rusted gates without looking back, the cold night air finally filling their lungs. But the silence even outside the park seemed to follow them, as if something was still watching them, waiting. The sky above Fairview was full of stars, as if nothing abnormal had happened that night. John and Rachel stood before the old gates of Starlight Amusement Park, panting and trembling, but alive. The park now seemed quiet, dormant, as if the forces that inhabited it had retreated into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. The cold night wind blew gently, making the dry leaves dance across the ground. The sound of the real world seemed distant, as if they were still trapped in some level of that nightmare. The air around them felt heavy, as if the silence that had pursued them inside the park still clung to them, even now that they were out. Rachel, her eyes red with tears, looked at John but said nothing. What could they say? The words that had once flowed between them now seemed useless. The weight of what they had experienced settled between them, an invisible barrier that separated them. John tried to speak, but something inside him stopped him. He still felt the echo of the park's silence as if it had seeped into his very soul. Without a word, the two walked away from the rusted gates, slowly heading back to town. Neither of them looked back. They knew that even though they were far from the park now, the horror wasn't over. Days later, news about the park's reopening began to circulate. Starlight Amusement Park, which had once been an iconic part of Fairview's history, was scheduled to be demolished and rebuilt by a group of investors. The entire town was buzzing about it, a new chance to bring life back to that forgotten part of Fairview. No one mentioned the disappearances. No one talked about the clown, but John and Rachel knew there was something more behind that park, something that couldn't be destroyed by demolition crews or renovation. They didn't talk about it with each other, but the silence between them said more than any words ever could. The following weekend, a new family arrived in town. They were on a road trip through the countryside and decided to spend the night in Fairview. It was a small, quiet place, perfect for resting. The couple, Tom and Linda Carter, were eager to spend some quality time with their children, Jake, 8, and Emily, 5. That afternoon, as they walked through the town, Tom overheard one of the locals talking about the old amusement park that was about to be rebuilt. "It'll be great for the kids," the man said, smiling. "It'll bring the town back to life." Curious, Tom decided to take his kids to see the place that same afternoon. Maybe they could take some pictures, explore the area before construction began. When they arrived, the kids were excited to see the rusted gates and the old sign. Jake ran ahead, followed closely by Emily, who laughed and played, unaware of the heavy atmosphere hanging over the park. The lights were off, the park as silent as a tomb. "Should we go in?" Linda asked, looking at her husband with slight concern. "We won't go far," Tom replied, holding Emily's hand. "Just a quick look." They passed through the gates, now unlocked. Jake ran ahead laughing, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. He stopped near the carousel, which was now covered in dust and cobwebs, but still standing. He climbed onto one of the wooden horses, pretending he was in a race. Emily, meanwhile, ran to the swings, her small hands gripping the rusted chains as she swung gently back and forth. She looked up at the sky, smiling. "Daddy, look, I'm flying." Tom and Linda laughed, relieved. The park seemed more like a harmless pile of ruins than a cursed place. But then the silence came. The children's laughter stopped suddenly. The wind ceased, and the entire park seemed to hold its breath. Tom looked around, feeling a shift in the atmosphere. Linda moved toward Emily, but something in the girl's expression made her stop. Emily was staring at the center of the park, her eyes fixed on something no one else seemed to see. "Mommy," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Who's that clown over there?" Linda froze, her heart racing. She turned slowly to where Emily was pointing, but she saw nothing. The park was empty, just shadows and broken rides. "There's no one here, sweetheart," Linda replied, trying to stay calm. But Emily kept staring. "He's smiling at me." And then, far off, almost imperceptible, a faint laugh echoed through the air. Not the joyful laugh of a child, but something much darker, like a whisper from the depths of the park. Tom looked at Linda, and the fear in her eyes said it all. They needed to leave. "Let's go," he said quickly, picking Emily up and calling for Jake. But as they walked toward the exit, Tom had the unsettling feeling that something was watching them, something hidden in the shadows of the park, waiting. They crossed the gate and left, but the sound of that laugh still echoed in their minds. Starlight Amusement Park remained silent, but the clown of silence's smile was always lurking, ready to start the cycle of horror once again.